Professor Tang did her PhD at Harvard University, and before joining the Grinnell College faculty, she also taught at Swarthmore College and Colgate University. And she's working on a book right now about divorce and the representation of divorced women in early medieval China. And I'm sure we will all be very excited when that book comes out. And Professor Tang will be talking to us today about divorce in early medieval China, 1st to 6th century AD. So I would like to warmly, on behalf of the School of Transnational Law, welcome Professor Tang. Professor Tang, over to you. And just to let our audience know, the format will be Professor Tang will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have about 15 to 20 minutes of questions and answers. If you have a question, please type your question in the chat box of Zoom. And then during the Q&A, I will choose some questions from the chat box and put them to Professor Tang. So you're most welcome to type in your questions in the chat box of Zoom. Without further ado, Professor Tang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Norman, Professor Ho, for your kind introduction and for your invitation. And thanks also to Beijing University School of Transnational Law for the opportunity to speak to this great audience. Thank you all for coming. So I have to say, first thing, that I'm not a legal scholar. I'm a scholar of literature. So I may be embarrassing myself by speaking to this experts in the field. So if you're an expert in the field of traditional Chinese law, this talk may not be of much use to you. Also, a few words on how I got interested in this topic. So back in grad school, when I was deciding on a dissertation topic, that was the time when the Chinese People's Supreme Court issued a new interpretation to the marriage law, which sparked a nationwide controversy. Many people felt that women's rights were undermined in the event of a divorce. And then interestingly, I'm giving a talk right now, just a few days before a new change will take effect to divorce in China, namely, as some of you know, the introduction of the cooling off period of 30 days, 离婚隔离期. So this new introduction will make the process of divorce more difficult, thus upsets a lot of people in China. But now I'm not gonna talk about the current situation in China. I will turn to the Six Dynasties period, the early medieval period, and to see how divorce was done back then, and how it felt like to be divorced at that period. So I'm gonna share my screen now. Share. So the period I will discuss is roughly from the Eastern Han period to the beginning of the Sui dynasty, from the 1st century to the end of the 6th century. As you can tell from this image here, when the Eastern Han collapsed in 220, China entered into a long period of division with only a brief unification under the Western Jin, which lasted from 265 to 316. To be precise, 280 to 316. So during this long period of division, there were many changes in the society, in the social and the familiar fronts of the lives in this period. So that's a background to keep in mind. So to understand divorce, ideally we would like to have a legal code that we can go by with, right? But the earliest extent a complete code from traditional China is from the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century. Now, Tang legal code was, of course, based on the previous codes issued, promulgated by the preceding dynasties. It was based on the Sui code, which was based on the Northern Qi court, in turn, which was based on the Western Jing court and the Chaowei court, and eventually in the Han and the Qing court. But unfortunately, we don't have the legal courts from the Han through the Sui survived to the day. Some fragments do survive, but most of it were lost. So what happened? Like how divorce was done in a period before the Tang Dynasty, during this early medieval period, is what I'm trying to talk today. So in my talk today, I will cover roughly these areas. I will first talk about the classical prescriptions on divorce and some legal aspects of divorce that we can that were evidenced by like transmitted texts or like materials excavated. And I will talk about this new phenomenon during this period of division, namely the two principal wives and how this phenomenon was related to the issue of divorce. And I will also touch upon the changing meanings of 议决, breaking the bond, which is codified as a cause for divorce in the Tang Dynasty. But as I will show during the 6th Dynasty period or this early medieval period, breaking the bond was not a legal term. So the classical prescription on some divorce is called 7 conditions, 七出, which include disobedient to her parents-in-law, unable to bear a son, licentious, jealous, having incurable diseases, gossipy, and if she's thief. If you look at these 7 conditions, you will find that they're actually very vague and unspecific. What does it mean to be disobedient? What kind of actions and speeches could be interpreted as a disobedience, for example, right? And unable to bear a son, what's the cutoff age for a woman? We know in the Tang Code, if a woman is 50 years or older, and if she can't bear a son, then she may be divorced on this ground. And having incurable disease, what kind of disease is incurable disease? Some scholars argue it was leprosy, but we don't really know for sure what disease that it refers to. And the case for jealousy, the charge for jealousy is most interesting to me. Like, you know, it's listed as one of the conditions for divorce. However, like in the early medieval period, some societies actually promote female jealousy. For example, I find in a memorial to a Northern Wei Emperor Shang Xiaojing Li Biao, this guy Yuan Xiaoyu says the following things. He said, people nowadays lack the standard principles. When parents marry their daughter, they teach her to be jealous. When aunts meet their niece, they urge her to be controlling. To be able to control one's husband is considered a wifely virtue. To be capable of jealousy is regarded as a womanly task. Well, like in a society that promotes female jealousy in practice, but like they were societies in Northern Wei, for example, right? But then like the classical prescription was like jealousy was a ground for divorce. Because like the classical prescriptions, the 7 conditions are very vague in term. So people in reality actually didn't really follow those conditions, 7 conditions. In historical records, you will see like a lot of divorce cases in which like a man divorces his wife for very strange reasons. For example, from the Western Han, Xi Han period, there was this guy Wang Ji who divorced his wife because she fed him dates from his neighbor's tree. Another story from the 5th century, Liu Huan divorced his wife because she dropped some dust on her mother-in-law's bed when she was drilling a hole to hang on the wall to hang shoes. Another story is about a guy called Sun Qian who divorced his wife because his cousin said she didn't take good care of him. So these cases show that, you know, there was this classical prescriptions on divorce. However, in reality, divorce was done very differently. In addition to the 7 conditions for divorce, there are 3 prohibitions. 三不去. If a woman meets one of the 3, she should not be divorced. She cannot be divorced, which goes if she had no family to return to when her husband was remarried, 有所娶无所归. If she had served 3 years of mourning for her parents-in-law, 与共更3年之丧. If the husband had been poor and humble in the past, a fate she shared with him, and became rich and noble now, 先贫贱后富贵. Again, like, I mean, except for the second condition, the third one is also fake too. Like, how do you define like poor and rich, right? So in general, I feel like the 7 conditions and the 3 prohibitions were not followed or were rarely followed in society. Also, the classical ritual text was silent on whether women had the right to divorce their husbands. But in reality, we also see like cases in which women initiated divorce. For example, you know, the famous story of Zhu Maichen, who was a scholar from the Western Han period. He was divorced because by his wife, because the wife was fed up by the impoverished life that she lived with him for a long time. And another scholar from the 4th century was divorced by his wife because his wife was similarly to Zhu Maichen's story. His wife was tired of living a poor life with this man, and she burned his books and asked for permission to marry someone else. Sometimes women would divorce their husbands due to jealousy. For example, there was this lady Xi, was said to be very jealous when her husband took a concubine. She was resentful and discontent, 怨怼, and sent her husband a letter to break up, 与书告绝. So the classical ritual text prescribed conditions for divorce, like prohibitions from getting from divorce, but they also prescribed the divorce procedure. If we look at this ancient ritual of divorce recorded in the Li Ji record, a classic of rites, which goes, when a feudal lord sends his wife away, she proceeds on her journey to her own state. She undertakes the journey according to rituals befitting a lord's wife, and is received there with the observance due to a lord's wife. The messenger accompanying her then discharges his commission, saying, my unworthy lord, from his want of ability, was not able to follow her and take part in the services at the altars and in the ancestral temple. She has therefore sent me so and so, and I venture to inform your officer appointed for this purpose of what he had done. The officer presiding on the occasion replies, my unworthy lord in his formal communication did not lay her defects before you, and he does not presume to do anything but respectfully receive your lord's message. The officers in attendance on the commissioner then set forth the various articles sent with the lady on her marriage, and those on the other side received them. It's a very civilized and ideal kind of process for divorce. Now, we know in the Han Dynasty, very similar but much simplified version still exist. According to Ban Gu's Bai Hu Tong, we are taught that when a wife is divorced, she must be respectfully sent back, and it should be received with the rituals befitting a guest. If we look at poetry, we also see like a similar process was depicted in the poem southeast fly the peacocks 孔雀东南飞. One section of the poem goes, out the door she went and mounted the carriage. Her tears fell in more than 100 rows. The prefectural clerk's horse, which is her husband's horse, was in the front, the young wife's carriage behind, right? This is the husband seeing off, sending the wife back to her parents' home. So judging from the template cited in the 史记, that long passage I just read, 礼记, one of the duties of the messenger was to convey the intent of a divorce verbally. This might have been changed into a written form in later times, such as a divorce letter, along with the general simplification of other divorce rituals. A divorce letter prepared by the husband and signed by various parties became an official part of the divorce procedure in the Tang Dynasty. According to a Tang statute issued in 737, we know that the husband, in the event of a divorce, has to personally prepare a divorce document. Signatures from him, his parents, his paternal uncles, his maternal uncles and aunts, her parents, her paternal uncles, her maternal uncles and aunts, their neighbors and witnesses are required. If one cannot write, one has to leave his or her fingerprints as a mark. From the Dunhuang cave, we actually have a dozen some like divorce letters. This one is one of the famous ones, called a divorce and wife releasing letter by this guy called Zhao Zongmi. The letter is beautifully written. Actually, Chinese people on the internet were so taken by this letter, especially these two lines. 一别两宽，更生欢喜. They're marveled by the civility of people in the Tang Dynasty in the event of divorce. According to some Han sources, a divorced woman would reclaim the dowry she brought with her at the wedding. In his commentary to the divorce process described in the Li Ji classic of rights, the Han Dynasty classical scholar Zheng Xuan said, statute, the divorced wife is given back what she brought. 律弃妻必所击. Zheng Xuan's comment indicates that it was a Han statute that women were entitled to reclaim their dowry in the event of divorce. This can be collaborated by some bamboo slips from a Han tomb discovered in the Zhangjiashan. These bamboo slips were produced in 186 BC or even earlier. So one of the slips reads, when a husband divorces his wife or when the husband dies, the wife can retrieve her property and become a household head again. When the husband divorces his wife, he gives the wife her property back. 其弃妻及夫死，妻得复取以为户，弃妻必之其财. So the classical ritual texts did not mention whether the divorced wife had to pay back the betrothal gifts her family had received, but returning these gifts seems to be practiced in later times. We find in poetry some evidence, which I will not go into in the interest of time. Of course, women were impacted by divorce. Ritually speaking, she may receive reduced or no mourning at all from her son. Her parents certainly will receive no mourning from her son. Now, in a traditional Confucian society, and that is China, this is a serious matter. Legally speaking, she would not be punished for the crime her husband or anyone in his family committed if the divorce was completed before the crime was discovered. And also she had the right, as I said, to claim her private property, which not only include the dowry, but also the property she inherited from her birth family prior to the marriage. Thirdly, the son of a divorced woman would lose the qualification to inherit the family property if his father had sons from his second principal wife. Financially speaking, a divorced woman could lose her source of support if her birth family was unable or unwilling to provide for her. But if she had nowhere to go after divorce, she could exempt from divorce according to the 3 prohibitions. So another slip from the Zhangjiashan Hanjian, Zhangjiashan Han bamboo slips, stated that the son of a divorced wife is not allowed to compete with the son of the succeeding wife to be the heir of their father. 弃妻子不得与后妻子争后. So the impact of divorce is not only just on the woman herself, but also for her sons. Even though Ban Zhao, in her admonitions for my daughters, 女戒, spoke of how she feared that a divorce might disgrace her birth family, the strong social stigma placed on divorced women that's seen in the later imperial or even modern times was yet to be felt in the early medieval period. A divorced woman could be just as desirable as a maiden in the marriage market. In other words, being divorced alone did not necessarily depreciate a woman's value as a potential marriage candidate. Now I will move on to talk about the phenomenon of 两敌, 2 principal wives, and also the ground for divorce, a new ground for divorce, breaking the bond, 议决. Before I do that, I will just quickly remind you of this chronology that's under discussion. So we are talking about the period, the early medieval period. As I said earlier, this period is characterized by constant warfare and also the division of China between North and South mostly. So during this period of time, a situation occurred in which a man kept 2 women as his principal wives, 两敌. So this phenomenon became like noticeable toward the end of the Eastern Han period, when the empire suffered continuous warfare waged by warlords. This phenomenon posed great challenges to the Orthodox ritual system and raised a series of social and political issues, not the least of which was the issue of inheritance, since only the son by a principal wife would have the right to inherit his father's official title. Now, this phenomenon 两敌 triggered heated debates in court as well as in society. At the core of these debates was the question of how to define the status of the 2 women and what constitute a divorce. So there are not many, there are a few causes for a 两敌 situation. The most important cause is the social mobility brought about by war, because during wartime, people move between rival regimes or like from place to place more frequently than the peaceful time. And imperial bestowing of wives on married subject could be cause for a 两敌 situation, as well as avoidance of legal collective responsibilities. There are 2 solutions to this dilemma. One is to set up a separate residence for one of the wives and her children. The other is to register both women as one's principal wife with the government and have them live under the same roof with the husband. Now, a regional difference is observed. The second method is only seen practiced in the South, and the first is seen practiced throughout China. This may have something to do with the different attitudes toward concubinage between the Northerners and the Southerners during this period of time. 两敌, this phenomenon is related to divorce because in the debates of 两敌, how to define the marital status of the 2 wives is a central question. And from the debates, we can tell that the definition of divorce is actually very ambiguous in the early medieval period. And these discussions and debates on 两敌 reveal to us that the understanding of what constitutes a divorce underwent some change during this period of time. During those debates, some scholar officials argued that physical separation be considered as a legitimate reason for divorce. Up to this period, the only conditions for divorce are the seven ones that I laid out at the beginning of the talk. Moreover, physical separation caused by geopolitical reasons seems to have justified women divorcing their husbands. As I said, women divorcing their husbands were practiced in society, but never in the history of China was such a was this theorized, by officials. So Liangdi cases experienced a surge in the 3rd century, understandably so, because 3rd century is the century of the Three Kingdoms period, for the most part. When the Han Empire dissolved in 220, China entered into this period of division among the three kingdoms. And this situation was ended only in 280. So there were six recorded cases from this period that received a lot of attention from officials. 2 such cases resulted from cross-regional travels between rival states, and 2 resulted from political searches of Tawei officials by Sima Shi, and 1 resulted from the Western Jing imperial bestowal of a wife on a defected Wu subject. And the circumstance of the last Liangdi case, that of Cheng Liang's, remains unclear. In one of the discussions of another Liangdi case from the early 4th century, an official said there have been many cases like this since war and turmoil broke out at the end of the 3rd century. So the Cheng Liang case, I will show it to you now, because in the next slide, I will show how this case inspired a discussion on a hypothetical Liangdi case. So in this case, this Cheng Liang is a governor. We know that he already had a wife. Later, he married again, whereupon he established both as his principal wives. After the first wife died, his son from the second wife was confused about the correct mourning rituals for his father's first wife. So Cheng Liang requested a discussion from the government on how to mourn his first wife by his son. So as I said, this real Liangdi case inspired a hypothetical Liangdi scenario, which Zhang Hua designed to solicit opinions from his colleagues. So this case sounds very similar to the previous Liangdi case, which goes X took Y as his wife, and later took Z as his wife, and concealed the existence of Y from Z. He acted as if both women were principal wives, and there was no hierarchical difference between them. How could the son of Z observe the mourning rituals for Y after Y died? The fact was that both wives were regarded equal, and no distinction was made between a principal wife and a concubine. Although having 2 principal wives was not right, the mistake was made by the father. How could a son arbitrarily make his own mother distant from his father by performing mourning rituals to Y that were appropriate to a principal wife? However, if the son offered mourning rituals to Y as a concubine, this would contradict the reality. I'm confused. How should one go about this? So 6 people involved in this were engaged in this debate, and 3 of them in group 1 argued that it was a mistake made by the father. The sons should not correct it and should observe 3-year mourning rituals for each other's mother. So they all endorsed the coexistence of 2 principal wives. However, the other group argued that a distinction between these 2 women needed to be made. And they proposed that the first who entered the household should be regarded as the principal wife, the second, the concubine. 先治为嫡，后治为庶。So they try to adhere to the ancient warnings against having 两嫡, two principal wives. And they basically degraded the second wife to the status of a concubine. Now we know there was a huge difference between a principal wife and a concubine. But all the participants of this debate agreed that the first wife should be considered as a principal wife. A few years later, in 280, another 两嫡 case was brought to the attention of the emperor. In this case, there was a man called Wang Bi from Changsha at the end of the Han Dynasty, around 220, went on a business trip to the north. And then after he arrived in the north, the Han Dynasty was ended. So he was stuck in the north. Now the north become Cao Wei Dynasty. So he served in the Cao Wei court and married a woman there, a northern woman, and then had a son with his second wife called Wang Chang. And he was separate from his first wife, Xi. In 280, when his home state Wu was subjugated by the Western Jin, his son from the second wife heard that his former mother, which means his father's first wife from the south, had long been dead, and asked for a discussion of her status so that he could observe the right mourning rituals for her. This debate is indeed a very large-scale debate. More than 20 high-ranking officials were participated. But interestingly, compared to the first debate I just went over, only 3 of the more than 20 officials agreed that the first wife, she should be considered a principal wife and should receive 3-year mourning from Wang Chang, the son by the man's second wife. And the rest 20-some officials all argued that the first wife should be regarded as a divorced wife. They have 2 lines of arguments. One is from the legal perspective. The other is from the political perspective. What's interesting to us is the legal argument here. So some participants argued for new grounds of divorce. New grounds for divorce, such as 缔结, divorce due to physical separation, 死决, divorce due to perceived death of one's spouse, and divorce due to imperial law. Some argue that when couples are separated, there is no reason for them to remain married. Some argue that when the husband the moment when the husband remarries is the moment when his former wife is divorced. Some argue that physical separation should allow divorce and the remarriage of both husband and wife. And some argue if the husband remarries, he already considered his first wife dead, even though no official divorce was made. And some simply said a former wife should be considered divorced no matter what, 前妻已决. So compared to the first debate called for by Zhang Hua, the difference is the majority of the people participated in this debate argue for the status of the first wife to be a divorced wife. Now, clearly there was some political context in which these participants argue for to regard the first wife as a divorced wife, because that's the only case where I see the first wife is degraded as a divorced wife in the debate of 两嫡 cases. I will not go into the political context here, but the takeaway from this debate is that new grounds for divorce were proposed. 议决 for the first time was used in the context of divorce. and according to one of the debate participants, 议决 refers to the 7 conditions, 议决 breaking the bond. And then also in this debate, we see theoretically women were given the right to divorce men, because one of them argued that physical separation should allow divorce and remarriage of not only the men, but also the women. And then one participant also proposed the length of physical separation, which should be more than 5 months. So the emperor who called for this debate gave his final verdict, and he agreed that physical separation is a legitimate reason for divorce. Since the first wife was regarded as divorced, then this is not a 两地 dilemma anymore. So let's talk about 议决, breaking the bond a little bit. So 议决 literally means breaking a bond due to one party's violation of some principles. 议决. It can happen to any relationship. It can happen between a ruler and his subject, 君臣. Can happen between a husband and wife, or among friends. I give you 2 citations. So the first one says, the way between a ruler and his minister is subject to the principles of union and separation. 君臣之道有和离之意. And then another citation goes, the conjugal relation includes the principles of separation and union. 夫妇之道亦有离合. So 议决 could happen to 君臣, minister, ruler and minister, or husband and wife. And it can also happen to other relations. The early medieval usage of 议决 that I could find, the first 2 cases apply to a relationship between husband and wife. The third case concerns a relationship between a nephew and his aunt. And the fourth is a relationship between a woman and her in-laws. When the bond between these relationships were broken, it could cause 议决. Clearly, 议决 it was not a legal term in early medieval period and did not become a legal ground for divorce until it was codified in the Tang law. But its provenance can be traced back to the Han Dynasty and its development in the long period between the Han and Tang. So in the Han Dynasty, according to Ban Gu's 白虎通, this is an interesting passage. So if a husband is wicked to his wife, she should not leave him. This is because there was no such a thing as earth leaving heaven. Husband is compared to heaven, wife is compared to earth. This is why even if the husband is wicked, the wife cannot leave him. However, if the husband upsets human relations and kills his parents-in-law, then he has given up on the law, which is a grave cause for chaos. Only under this circumstance, when the bond was broken, can the wife leave him. As I said earlier, that the classical ritual texts did not say anything about the wife's rights to divorce husbands, but this is the first time that we see, under this extreme condition, the wife had the right to divorce her husband. In the Tang Dynasty, we know 议决, breaking the bond, is defined as a legal cause for divorce in addition to 7 conditions. So 七出 and 议决 are 2 different causes for 2 different categories for divorce. And 议决 is defined specifically as husband beating or killing the wife's family members, or the family members of the husband and wife kill each other, or the wife beats or curses or kills or wounds her husband's family members, or there was illicit sexual intercourse taking place among family members, or the wife attempts to harm the husband. These are the conditions for breaking the bond. When any of this happens, a divorce is mandatory. So we, as you can tell, like 议决, breaking the bond, started with just expression for any bond broken due to one party's violation of some principles. But gradually, it was incorporated into the legal context and become a legal ground for divorce in the Tang Dynasty. I suspect that there is no hard evidence for me to propose this, but I suspect the discussions and debates on Liang Di, two principal wives, was one of the occasions where the term 议决 was gradually being incorporated into the legal discourse. So to conclude, I will say divorce was a common phenomenon in the early medieval period. It took place at all levels of the society and could be initiated by both men and women. Reasons for divorce varied greatly from one case to another. The 7 conditions were sometimes evoked or implied, but many divorce cases had no direct relation to the classical prescriptions on divorce. Men might divorce women for reasons such as career advancement, political opportunism, or financial improvement. Women might divorce men for a better material life or a better marriage companion. Due to the period from the end of Han Empire to the unification of China under the Sui, the unstable social and political environments propelled the emergence of some new phenomenon in social and familiar lives. The 2 principal wives anomaly was one of the new situations in marriage life, and was a special case for divorce. In the debates on Liang Di situations, new grounds for divorce were proposed. The right for female to initiate divorce was suggested. Under the Tang Code, codification of divorce were greatly expanded, resulting from changes and revisions made in the preceding centuries. That's it. I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Tang, for that very interesting and thorough discussion. I was especially struck. One might argue that the divorce and the perception of divorced women in the early medieval period. So what is that? That's now what? I'm terrible at math, but what, 1600 years ago? They probably are a bit more progressive than China today. But anyway, that's sort of just an offhand, in terms of perception of divorced women, that's sort of just an offhand comment. But we now have time for questions, and so feel free to submit your questions by chat, or if you would like to ask a question on video, please do so. Professor Tang, I see we have one question that came in on chat a few minutes ago, so why don't we start with that one? This participant asked, basically asking about religion or religious attitudes at the time. I think it's a broader question because you mentioned that the social stigma attached to divorced women, we don't have much evidence of that social stigma in the period you're discussing. That comes later in the later imperial era. And so I think this question is basically asking, what exactly led to that social stigma? Was it certain religious attitudes? Was it philosophical changes or intellectual changes?
This is a very good question. Thank you for asking this. I think this social step, even in the Tang Dynasty, I feel like we didn't really see the kind of stigma that women experienced, divorced women experienced. I think maybe it has to do with this new Confucian kind of idea on womanhood, or later in the late imperial period. Women had to observe widow chastity, that sort of thing. Fidelity to one husband. The idea of fidelity to one's husband has always been in there, like it was prescribed in the classical ritual texts as well. But seems like early medieval period, during that period of time, women didn't really follow that very much. So that's why I said I don't really observe the kind of social stigma that we see often, women often experience later times. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. So we took one question from chat. Does anybody want to ask a question over video? Okay, Professor Snyder, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can, yes.
Professor Tang, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I should say I'm not an expert in this field at all, but I have two questions. First one, you presented the divorce patterns and so on very much as individual to individual with some references to the families. And I would like to know more about whether this was clan to clan transaction and the role of marriage and divorce in the wider social relationships. Because from what I have read, this was extremely important, and not only in China, but in many other parts of the world, even today, of course. The second question, if I may, is about the institutional structure. You mentioned the codes. As I recall, the codes in China at that time were not at all like the codes we have today in the so-called civil law system. So I would like to know something about the institutional structure in the sense of which institutions were involved in absorbing and recognizing changes in the rules. That's the main gist of my question about the institutional structure outside the parties. You gave some ideas about this, but I would like to learn a little bit more. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions. To answer the first one, it's definitely, if I give you the impression that divorce was an individual matter, that I didn't do a good job. Marriage and divorce were the business of two clans, two families. It was never the business of two individuals. And that's why, like, you know, in a case of a divorce, signatures from the family members on both sides were involved, were given, and it's sometimes even neighbors' signatures were required. So it's really a communal event, not an individual event. To answer your second question, divorce, like civil matters such as marriage and divorce disputes were handled by magistrates, who were appointed by the emperor. So it is different from the Western legal system, where like two parties present their evidence to a judge, and then the judge make a ruling. I think in China, in the Chinese tradition, the regional magistrate, the local magistrate, was the one who handled the disputes, and there was no hearing, I don't think, involved. So it is different from the Western tradition. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll continue just basically in the interest of fairness, just write down the chat. So whoever has the question earlier. So the next question we have is, Professor Tang, you mentioned that there were some regional differences between North and South in the practice of Liangdi. And this participant was curious if you have observed any regional differences between North and South in divorce practices generally from the texts?
It's a very good question. There is certainly regional difference between Northerners and Southerners in all areas in politics, in culture, in family life. In terms of divorce, I think the Southerners, when they're confronted with a 两地 dilemma, they tend to like find a solution that's agreeable to everyone involved. That's why like the practice of having both wives registered as principal wives with the government was only seen in the South. But in the North, I think people were much more concerned with the orthodox idea of status, right? A woman should be a principal wife because a concubine is very lowly. So like no one wants to be a concubine. So if two women are found in a 两地 situation, they and also their respective children will fight and will like file legal suits over and over again to fight for their mother's status for as a principal wife. So in that case, like, you know, it's a much more kind of confrontational between the family members of the two women, between the two women. So I think another thing is like, I think in the South, people generally, I think people were more okay with concubines and sons born of concubines will have a fair chance to succeed in society. But in the North, if a man was born by a concubine, his career will be ruined no matter how talented he is. That's why it's a life and death kind of situation for people in the North. You know, if they're confronted with a 两地 situation, they had to fight rigorously. Yeah. So I think there are certainly like regional differences to the in this matter.
Then the next question on chat asks about 议决. And so this seminar participant asks, I guess just for more details about 议决 and the consideration of 议决. So if a divorce is under a 议决 ground, if a husband kills his parents-in-law, his wife has a right to divorce her husband. But if a husband beats or curses his wife, can the wife be justified to divorce her husband? Is there any way for her to divorce her husband in that ground? Any sources tell us anything about that?
During the period that I studied, the early medieval period,
yes.
I don't think the woman had the right to divorce her husband, even if her husband scolded or beat her family members. Actually, there was a story from the Han Dynasty that tells, so there was a lawsuit from the Han Dynasty that concerns this couple. So the wife was sentenced to a commuted death for slapping on her mother-in-law's face because her husband beat her alcoholic father for asking money from her husband. And so the judge ruled, he said, well, you know, your husband beat your father. It's not insignified by his mother. Why did you slap her on her face? So you should be punished by a commuted death penalty. Well, in this ruling, interestingly, the husband was not punished, was not penalized for his action. The wife was punished. But then, like, if we consider this case in a Tang Dynasty, then a compulsory divorce will be required because that violated the ground for divorce, which is breaking the bond, 议决, right? But in the previous dynasties, I don't think that was the case. You know, what women cannot divorce their husband if he, you know, violate her family members.
So I suppose she didn't have the grounds to divorce if the husband violated her family members. So what if he violated her, insulted her, or beat her, or?
I don't think she could. I don't think she could divorce her either. I mean, like, she would divorce him in reality. You know, I think when it comes to divorce, women have power if they came from good family, had support from their family, then they could they can be very overbearing. They could be very exceedingly jealous. There were so many stories about jealous women of this period. They could really, overpower their husbands, and they could definitely divorce them. But that's not prescribed in the ritual texts.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. And so I apologize to those participants who asked questions in the chat box. And unfortunately, we're out of time. We can't get to them. But please.
Norman, can you capture the questions so I could look at it later?
Sure.
The questions I haven't got to answer. Yeah.
Sure. I'll just let me just copy paste that now, because I think Zoom will. When this is over, it tends to, okay, I've copied and pasted it. I'll send that to you later. But please join me in thanking Professor Tang for a very stimulating and thorough presentation. And thank you all for also your participation and your support of the seminar series. I also want to thank our staff member, Ms. Carrie Tan, who is here on screen for her assistance and all of the administrative and technical Zoom aspects for the seminar. So thank you, Professor Tang, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for coming to the talk. Have a good evening.